right. What's up, everybody? It's episode 7 of The Rising Tide. Oh, shit. Episode 7 of The Rising Tide. How y'all doing? I'm your co-host, Dayton and Boys. Sitting next to me is...
Dale Smith.
Awesome, gang. Awesome, gang. Well, we have a very interesting episode today. We have some international news, a lot of international news, some statewide news, and some citywide news coming from San Francisco in this lovely episode. So the way we like to do it, or at least how we're going to do it today, is we're going to do this from the general, the widest, to the most specific. Okay, we're going to go globally and back down to locally. All right, and so it's an auspicious day today. Today marks 15 days of war on Iran between the United States and Israel. So folks who may not know, for the last 15 days, Israel, principally in the United States, have been bombing targets in Iran, and I think according to sources inside Iran, I think it was just around 1,400 civilians have been killed in missile strikes carried out by the United States and Israel. Most recently, it was corroborated that a Tomahawk missile strike on a girls' elementary school led to the death of over 150 schoolgirls. The United States was trying to avoid responsibility for this missile strike, but third party and even their own sources have confirmed that it was U.S. munitions that were used to blow up this girls' school, and the United States is principally responsible for this current wave of civilian fatalities in Iran. And so this is a complex issue. I think first, in order for us to understand how we got here, we have to understand that the United States has been preparing to mount massive operations against Iran for over 50 years, right? So since the overthrow of the Shah, there's been this consistent effort within the U.S. political calculus to ultimately deal with the nation of Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and bring it back into its sphere of influence, right? And so we have to understand the rounds of U.S. and previously British interference is all around that basic goal to make sure that the nation of Iran, its resources, and its role within the political calculus of the region is firmly under the controls of the West. That goes back to even previous coups by the British against Mossadegh, the Democratic leader, and then to the installation of the Shah, a leader who had been deposed in Iran at that point, and leading his almost 20-year regime, which again ended with revolution that also haphazardly put into the present theocratic regime. And brought to international prominence the leader Ayatollah Khomeini, who was killed in some of the first days of this current war. He's been kind of presently, one of the U.S.'s, so-called boogeymen. Obviously, he's not a democratic leader. He's not a progressive leader. He was a religious leader. But at the same time, it's never been a good thing for the United States to assassinate another country's leader. It's never led to more democratic, peaceful reform. It's often led to civil conflict and ultimately foreign domination. And so you need to see that the U.S.'s intervention is principally around that. It's principally to create such a change in Iranian society to make them amenable to U.S. and Western control. Be that through, fomenting some type of civil conflict that just totally takes Iran off the board, or just rapidly moving in some other alternative form of government that's just openly in favor of the United States. And so, we need to see this war as a part of that goal. And so a lot of these things start to make more sense. More principally, in fact, you understand that the Iranian government, the Iranian society has been preparing to be invaded by the United States for almost since 77, right? And so, it's not so simple as how the United States chose to invade Iraq or Afghanistan. There's much more on the line in terms of Iran's ability to counterattack as well as defend its territory. And so the impact of these first 15 days of conflict has, in some ways, been small, but it's also growing, right? And so I think in some cases, Americans have seen like a 60% rise in the price of gas, 60 cents per gallon rise in the price of gas. In some instances, energy prices have shot up as Iranian missiles target oil and natural gas infrastructure all over the Gulf region. They've been striking targets in Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, as well as launching missile attacks into the occupied territories, sometimes referred to as Israel. And, the United States and Israel has only escalated their own missile attacks on Iran, with Israel even expanding their missile attacks into Lebanon, because Hezbollah militants, nominally aligned with Iran, but dominantly opposed to the Zionists, have been launching rocket attacks into the occupied territories of Israel. And hence, the Israelis have been expanding their missile and rocket barrages into southern Lebanon. Part of their also attempt to further occupy southern Lebanon and occupy more of their territory, displace the Lebanese people and even the Palestinian refugee people that live in southern Lebanon. And so we have this massive troop buildup in the whole region, a troop buildup of destroyers and attack vessels in the waters around Iran, comparable to some of the buildup that we saw before the surge that led to the occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think just last night, Trump deployed a Marine unit that could be used in ground operations in Iran. So this is a new story, right? Just coming out that the president has just put together a Marine Expeditionary Unit that it's on its way. And so they're aboard the amphibious assault ship, the USS Tripoli, which is based in Japan, and they're being sent over to the Gulf region. So I think it kind of just demonstrates that, even if a ground invasion isn't necessarily incoming by, say, this next coming week, they're not necessarily leaving that off the table. They are considering trying to do a full-scale ground invasion, so we should take that very seriously. But also understand that the United States supply chains isn't necessarily going to allow them to just repeat the last 25 years of the war on terror. There's real serious political and economic concerns, right? But we also have to really see that this current phase of U.S. imperialists is so much more bold-faced, right? Because if you're like an older person like myself, you remember the initial occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan. And you really remember the veneer of sort of neoliberal international human rights legalism that entire period was draped in, right? The United States needed to occupy these countries in order to make sure that these people could be free because they were ruled by people that just hated American freedom, Western freedom and values, and just wanted to oppress everybody. So the only people that were able to fix that situation were the U.S. imperialists. 25 years later, it all seems like such a ridiculous lie. And it's even more telling now that even the present U.S. imperialists, they don't feel the need to actually repeat that lie even. Obviously, for folks who have been paying attention, Iran has been the center of a lot of different mass demonstrations over the last several months, largely in response to rising economic sanctions placed on them by the United States, but also due to the ongoing internal contradictions within Iranian society between the masses of people and the theocratic regime. The United States has leveraged this unrest as further evidence of why their missile attacks are important, why their war is ultimately just, right? The Iranian regime deserves to be overthrown. Of course, they don't say as clearly so that it can be run by the United States or some of its puppets, right? So I think that's something that is important, particularly for people on the left, folks who are opposing war, is that while we have to stand firmly against U.S. intervention in other countries, principally in regions that have already been ravaged by genocidal wars, and ultimately see that these foreign interventions do no good for the people there. They do no good for anything that's going on. And they ultimately also expose like the larger political relationships in the region, right? That it's not just a larger religious conflict because so many of the other Arab states are already aligned with the United States and Israel and working actually to contain Iranians' self-defense of their territory. You have like the governments of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, UAE, Oman, all shooting down missiles headed toward Israel. Right, shooting down missiles meant to attack U.S. military assets in the region, and just realizing, how many of these Arab states have Israeli and Arab military and American military assets in their borders that are being used to aggress militant groups in Palestine, in Gaza, in Lebanon. The government of Iran, the people of Iran, as well as the people of their own countries, right? And understand that, Iran is actually quite alone, actually, in the whole region of being unaligned with the U.S. imperialists and the Zionists. And that seeing that contradiction between the people, between the Zionists, between the U.S. imperialists is like the dominant contradiction of that region. And that no progressive change can actually happen if they're continually aggressed by the U.S. imperialists. So the U.S. needs to stay out of the regions. The U.S. stay out of the region. So I'm curious some of your thoughts on this, Dale. On this rapidly developing area issue, right? There's a chance of even further escalation of this conflict. It's already spread over to Lebanon. So yeah, what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is just like, honestly, just an ever constantly devolving shit show at this point. Um, I feel like it's really obvious in a lot of ways that this is causing serious fractures, even within like the greater imperialist order. Like I think like we see that as like countries like France and other European countries are like trying to renegotiate energy deals as this stuff is happening. It's clear that like the United States just did this because this is what Israel wanted to do and what the United States has been trying to do for decades. And we brought this up on a previous episode when they did like a an exercise or like basically an estimate of like what would happen if they tried to invade Iran. This was like in the early 2000s. It was a catastrophe, and we're seeing what that looks like right now in some respects, only even worse because the people that are doing it have even less understanding of the nuance that is required to go into a situation like this. I think realistically, some of these folks probably thought it would have been just as easy as Venezuela. Um, and like we're seeing this happen as like the U.S. is actually trying to shift a lot of their different presence in other parts of the world. What actually is could end up being like a huge strategic blunder in a lot of respects. We're seeing how they're trying to move a lot of their ships from the Pacific over to the Mediterranean. But that puts a lot of the U.S.'s allies in the Pacific and in Eastern Asia at risk. I think like the big thing that comes to mind in particular is like with Taiwan. This puts the potential for Chinese aggression against Taiwan to finally end the civil war at a much higher stake. And like what does that mean for a lot of folks? A lot of people might not think of like Taiwan as that significant. They might be like, oh, well, we need to like free Taiwan and like screw China or whatever. It's like, but if China ends up taking over Taiwan or ends up successfully like like blockading it, that's going to have a huge impact for our economy based on like a lot of you know, the chips that are being produced there that for AI specifically, but just in general, the semiconductor production that is happening there isn't something that the US market can replicate anytime in the next, I don't know, even 10 or 20 years, realistically. Um, and yeah, like I think like if we're looking specifically at like what's happening with the US trying to attack Iran with Israel's help, um, it's really just a lot of like poor gamesmanship in some ways. I think like recently there was like a huge strike on, I think it's like the island of Karg or whatever, and they basically took out all the facilities on there except for the oil facilities because this would have a huge economic impact on the entire world. And like some of the things that Trump and the U.S. military are threatening to do, it's like they just don't make sense. It doesn't make sense to like do an all-out assault on on an area that has like facilities that are like thousands of meters, if not like miles underground. It doesn't make sense to do a full-on like all out like ground war when you don't have the backing of like a lot of folks that a lot of countries that the US did have the backing of when they invaded Afghanistan, when they invaded Iran, specifically because like there's a lot of like economics that are tied into this. And it's like interesting how it's playing out because even though like it's really messing up a lot of things in a lot of respects, it's also like playing in favor of a lot of the countries that the US is opposed to. For example, like with Russia, this is like causing the US to move a lot of what they're doing with Ukraine away from that front into this particular front, and that plays into Russia's hands specifically. At the same time, I think the thing that a lot of people are seeing is that China and Russia are not providing really any sort of like significant support to Iran in this situation, which is a little bit surprising to me. But I think it shows that like they're thinking beyond this particular moment, and they're trying to see how it plays out within the coming weeks, because ultimately I don't think the US is going to end up being successful in whatever they do. um, and I also think it's like this is not only causing like huge fractures within American society in some respects, because obviously people don't want to go into another war like this. The vast majority of Americans don't support this happening. They don't really see the point in it happening, especially when, you know, gas prices are skyrocketing at this point. You know, it's like $100 for a barrel or whatever. And that's like, you know, it keeps going up like $10 every week as long as this is happening. And the only times that it stabilizes is when Trump comes out and says something that is like, you know, alluding to the US backing down or actually doing that. But realistically, they don't really have a way out of this situation aside from, you know, making these empty threats that they can't follow up on because they don't really have a clear plan to actually finish this. And I don't think realistically they ever did, you know. And I think like one last point too is, you know, it's obviously causing some, you know, fractures within, you know, the government and American society, and like the people are really seeing what's happening in some respect. But we're not seeing a massive anti-war movement like we saw in the early 2000s. But it's definitely causing some serious fractures within Israeli society. You know, it's like the government has straight up come out and said like, don't post what's happening here on the internet, or else you will be severely, you know, reprimanded for what you're doing. You know, there will be severe repercussions for that. And what does that mean? It means they're getting hit pretty hard, you know? And the fact that, like, you know, I think recently there's been a number of like AI videos and potentially pictures that have come out of Netanyahu, and people are asking, like, where is he? You know, there's rumors circulating whether he's dead or not. I'm not sure, but the fact that those rumors are circulating and people are like, why would the government feel like they need to put this out instead of like having him just talk? It shows that they're in a really bad position too, you know? And so I think like ultimately, what does that mean? You know, I think it puts the people in a really advantageous position. You know, if we're seeing these fractures in the government, in how they're handling this situation, if we're seeing it potentially, you know, like sully this relationship with other imperialists and other people that they normally would side with, you know, it puts everybody else in a really advantageous position if people get organized, you know, if they come together and like try and find a way to, you know, end this war, expose this stuff for really what it's all about, and do something about it, you know. So I think despite, you know, all this really messed up stuff happening, and I don't want to say like, you know, it's a good thing that this is happening, but it does provide a tremendous opportunity at the same time. So yeah, I don't know, there's some what I've been thinking about recently, but
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, in order for it to be an opportunity, there has to be like somebody to seize on it, you know?
yeah.
And I think, you know, you look at Iranian society right now, and these folks have been, you know, struggling against the theocracy for a long time, right? And obviously, there's not going to be like some opening created by the US's interference there,
Mm-hmm.
right? And particularly in a society that, you know, the Ayatollah and his regime has worked so hard to sort of like take apart the leftist movement in Iran, right?
Yeah.
There really isn't like a long memory of struggle going on, right? And then you have like the diaspora movement here, which is all like, you know, fiercely pro Shah, pro U.S. intervention.
Yeah, it's pretty gross.
Yeah, it's pretty gross because like when the fuck ever have like Israeli bombs ever fixed anyone's problems? It's ridiculous. Yeah, I think that was something I saw online, and somebody said it really helped the Nazis, and I'm like, no, it did not. That was the Soviets, dumbass. Like, sorry,
People
wrong
love to
bomb.
forget how much the Soviets did.
Yeah, right. Like,
It's like
sorry.
they really did end the European front.
Like never, the United States has never deposed a dictator. Like never, never. I mean, you could make an argument with like with Serbia, with what is it?
Saddam, maybe.
Yeah, Saddam, and he was our guy. You know,
He was our guy for a
until
long
he
time.
wasn't
So.
guy. And I think that's the difference here, right? Is we see along these contradictions, right, with the and then of rising inter-imperialist competition, right? That, you know, Iran, the present theocracy, the Islamic Republic, is very much, you know, lined up behind Russia and China, as you've already shared before. But even them, they're kind of hedging their bets around how they can actually counteract the United States here. It seems like they're kind of just allowing this to become like another quagmire. I think ultimately they're going to start like leveraging some level of support. They can't just allow Iran to totally be packed up by the United States. You know, there's a good example looking forward as you look toward the conflict in Syria, right? Bloody civil war that went on for 10 years until ultimately the Russians and the Iranian backers of Assad were so pinned up in the war in Ukraine, defending themselves in Iran's case at that time, just a year and a half ago, year and some change, were again deflecting Israeli rocket missile attacks themselves, right? And that there was that opening that allowed the United States to do that final push to take Assad's regime out. And so it seems like you see this movement of Iran sort of in line with like Trump's board of peace on Gaza, is they're really trying to make moves back on these regions in big ways to really bring this stuff up. And this is after almost I think almost 20 years of the pivot toward the Pacific started under Obama, right? The move to pivot to corner China in the Pacific. And so now, as we discussed already, there's some attempts to reshuffle those military assets that are put in the Pacific to sort of hem things up in the Middle East. So you see like an imperialist entity that is wildly oscillating between two theaters of conflict in order to sort of move against and cut off its adversaries.
Mm.
And so I think if we see it in these terms, we kind of see that the conflict in Iran is just one aspect of this international struggle taking place internal to the international imperialist classes that are composed of China, Russia, and principally the United States, and its running dog Israel that sometimes wags the dog, like in this case, right? Like, I think it's interesting this point, because like this point, the idea that Israel has dragged the United States into this war. On one hand, that is correct, right? We also just see that the United States really has wanted this war for decades, right? Or members of the government have wanted this war for decades. So they quickly will just unite with any effort by the Israelis to provoke greater war. Because this isn't the first time, even in the last 2 or 3 years, that Israel has bombed Iran. But this is like the first time in recent memory the United States is, or not recent memory, I shouldn't say it's like so recent, but in let's say the last 2 years, the United States has actually followed along with the Israelis to actually continue bombing as well, right? So the administration, as Dale's already talked about, sort of like haphazardly decided that now is the time to move, and then it creates this cascade of other contradictions. And so this is something that we need to monitor closely. There is a chance that this could escalate into ground operations. Folks who remember the occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan remember how abysmal those went. And I think this possible occupation, if that's being considered, of Iran, would even be even more of a catastrophe.
Oh, absolutely. It's already starting to play out really poorly. And we're seeing the government's response. It's
Yeah.
like people are rightfully, pointing out, it's like, oh, look at how disrespectful like Trump is, and what the fuck, like, why are they stacking coffins on top of coffins instead of like minivans and stuff? But then, it's like we'd see just how, the ruling class deals with this stuff in general. I showed you that one picture the other day of all the all of the service members that have been killed, the U.S. service members that have been killed so far, and it was listing their names, and one of their names was covered by a stock ticker.
Yeah, hell
It's
yeah.
like that's so disgusting, but
Yeah.
also like, it's like a very dark humor. It's hard not to laugh at that, but it also really shows like what this is about. This isn't actually to liberate the people of Iran. No, I don't think anybody is convinced of that, except for, I don't know, the Iranian diaspora, who are like pretty reactionary, and all the people who are just generally confused by this, or in line with imperialism. But it's clear, the government doesn't have like a real plan for success, and they think that they can just that they can just bulldoze their way through like they have in other ways. I really do think in some ways, like what happened in Venezuela, they're like, oh, we can just do this again. But it's like, yeah, but they just, they just got the Ayatollah's son, and now what are you going to do? Now are you going to try and kill him? Like, it's like, what's going on?
All right. So this is a rapidly developing situation. So we'll have more updates as the situation develops. So I think we're able to move on to our California story.
Yeah, definitely. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about, a particular candidate for this upcoming presidential election. Now, this candidate isn't somebody that has actually started their campaign, but has definitely made movements and, said that they're going to do it recently, and it's nobody other than the current governor of California, Gavin Newsom. So, the question about whether he's going to be running for president under the 2028, Democratic Party ticket, has come forward again a lot more recently, especially within the past year. But I also feel like within the past couple weeks, there's been a lot of lack of discourse online. I want to call it discourse, but obviously, when people are just posting online about stuff, it's not really people talking about things. Um, and so, even though he hasn't started an official campaign yet, we saw midway through last year he was clear. It was clear he was changing his position on potentially running, and he's also changing his messaging and reach to some capacity. One of the things that was most noteworthy is a year ago, he started up a podcast where he pretty much exclusively hosts conversations that pander to far right figures such as Steve Bannon, Ben Shapiro. I think like the first person he had on his podcast was the now late Charlie Kirk. And he's at the same time, last summer was trying to act like he's some sort of like resistance leader against Trump. Like when he deployed the National Guard to LA against Newsom's wishes. So, despite these attempts to reach to a broader base, I feel like this has generally been met with ire from people on both sides of the aisle, given that Newsom's tendency to produce extremely cringeworthy moments. One thing that came up recently was he made some pretty disparaging comments against Black people in a talk with the mayor of Atlanta, Andre Diggins, where Newsom stated, "I'm just trying to impress upon you. I'm like you. I'm no better than you. I'm a 960 SAT guy." Really, and after the fact, he was like, "Well, you don't get it. Like, I've really struggled with dyslexia and all this sort of stuff." And it's like, yeah, but you grew up rich. Like, you're a white dude from California. You're a corporate Democrat. I feel like in a lot of ways, he is like the poster child of corporate Democrat. When I think about that term, which I feel like is kind of a loaded term, he's the face that comes up for me, and that's kind of who he's been his whole career. I also think about like, in particular, his inability to hold ground on important issues, like when he flip-flopped on calling ICE to quote unquote state-sponsored terrorism on his X account, and then backed down from it recently when Shapiro disagreed with him on his podcast. I think that's really telling. I think that's really typical in a lot of ways that a lot of these like diehard liberals act. It's like, oh, we can like disagree on like certain points, and ultimately, if I say something too strong, I'll end up coming around and being like, oh, actually, you're right. And I really want to underline the fact that it probably wasn't him that posted this on his Twitter. It was likely an intern or somebody from his staff that felt like it would have made for a good viral tweet moment. But at the same time, these aren't actually positions that he strongly holds. And it's clear in the fact that he really backs down from this stuff when he's really like confronted on these stronger stances that are quite popular in a lot of respects. I think a lot of people see what's happening with ICE in particular and are like, yeah, like this is state sponsored terrorism. This stuff is really horrible. Like this does need to come to an end. We need to actually get rid of ICE. We need to abolish ICE instead of like, oh, we just need to give them body cams and like the same training, even though realistically, like body cams don't work, training doesn't work. A lot of these people are trained. They just don't have to be held to the same standard. Not that that makes a difference in the long term, but I think there's a lot of misinformation about this stuff in general. So, on one hand, it does seem like there's a lot of people who don't take this guy seriously. But I think I realized a couple weeks ago that he does have some sort of base of support. And his base of support is likely a lot of like diehard Democrats who fall into the quote unquote vote blue no matter who category. And a lot of these people started being really vocal online about how he is the candidate for us, a couple weeks ago when Newsom started his book tour, I think in like February or whatever. People from this camp in general, I feel like take this hypocritical stance that it's the quote unquote left that is not capable of winning anything. They're not a sizable force. But at the same time, they're saying that they're wreckers and that, progressives are directly responsible for losing the last few elections for the Dems, despite the fact that if we look at the numbers, like we just look at the data, it's very clear that even if you took all of the third party voters, it would not make up the difference between Trump and Kamala. If you took all the people who didn't vote and put them into the Democratic Party vote, that would have made a difference. But at the same time, a lot of these people are more interested in pandering to the right, pandering to the status quo than actually, following through with this idea of like um, you know, dinner table policies, dinner table politics, or whatever the term is, things that people actually care about and actually doing them. Um, and so I think like most of these folks are also putting forward the position that unless progressives can actually put forward a better candidate, they cannot criticize the current candidate, even though realistically he hasn't even started his election campaign and no decision has been made within the party that he is their guy. So I find it, quite fascinating in some ways that, a lot of these people who are supposedly the loudest about democracy are putting forward an extremely anti-democratic line when there's still over 2.5 years out before, this upcoming presidential election, which is at the end of 2028. It's the beginning of 2026. And I think this is a pretty small minority compared to where most people are at, but this camp is still particularly loud and obnoxious. And I think it really underlines the fact that, there's this term, blue MAGA, that we've used before. And I think these folks are blue MAGA, or they're at least adjacent to it. So I don't know. I'd be curious to hear, what your thoughts are, Dayton. If Newsom were to actually start a campaign, would he get on the ticket? Does he have a chance against someone like Vance? Is he actually capable of moving left, being held accountable, putting forth an actually progressive policy? Or are his corporate roots ultimately indicative of his deep positions and the reality that he is sort of like the poster child of quote unquote corporate Democrats?
Yeah, I think he's like the last face that the corporate Dems really have,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like the
Yeah.
staunchly corporate Dems. He's like worked to like build this sort of national image as opposed to his his statewide or local image of being like a center left reasonable progressive guy, right? Like I can think of like 2011 or let's say like 2014 when he was lieutenant governor, right? He like who was known for making his stances against tuition hikes, right? So he
Mm.
like had some sense of being in adjacent to some of these youth movements at that time,
Mm-hmm.
as well as progressive stances on things like marijuana legalization and closing tax loopholes.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, his record is of complete corporatization, right? Like you
Mm-hmm.
think of even just when he was a San Francisco mayor, closing up different welfare the systems, right? Um, I can't remember what did he call it when he ended welfare in San Francisco. It had a really patronizing
Mm.
name. What was it? Instead of it was like limiting handouts was basically his reasoning in SF mayor, right? The idea that we need to give people resources, or rather, give people different opportunities outside of direct aid, and then he takes his money, and redirects it into the general fund of San Francisco, and then he
Mm.
gets gobbled up by these other corporate interests. And
Very typical.
it's the basic. That's his basic pattern, moving up to higher and higher office. Is the idea that he's standing for these so-called liberal progressive values, but at the end of the day, he's creating these boons for these major corporations, these major real estate corporations, and then, and also you see just the real political opportunism that even these so-called minority groups that he claims to stump for, he's willing to throw them under the bus to sort of widen his appeal amongst the general audience. And I
Mm-hmm.
think this just goes back to kind of like the subjectivity of the ruling class. That the ruling class really kind of, as they get more up in their ivory towers, they really struggle to see where the meter is, because you have to be really fucking stupid to think that Charlie Kirk is going to like build your voter base, right? Like I think that's just also important, right? Because Charlie Kirk is not a grassroots figure. Like he's not. Like he's literally an astroturf Trump plant, right? He was put, he's Koch brothers money. Like his father was like some Trump asset, right? And so the guy was put in place to sort of create the image that young people were tired of leftism and wanted to like convert to evangelicalism and stop having premarital sex. It's ridiculous. Right. And he just has some base on the internet. You can see all these people that making memes about Charlie Kirk. We are Charlie Kirk, the AI slop that's coming out. Right. And so, you really see how he tried to align himself sort of tangentially with the fringes of this like MAGA movement, on this idea is like, well, maybe I can peel off some of these MAGA people into my new coalition, versus actually running on grassroots campaigns, grassroots issues to sort of bring people that are disenfranchised back into the electoral system, right? That's a real opportunity. And I think these
Mm-hmm.
social democratic people, like let's go back to people like Mamdani, that's basically what they run on, right? Their idea is that they're going to, still essentially be, mainstream Democrats. Mamdani is a mainstream Democrat. I'm sorry, everybody. He's a De Blasio liberal. It's okay. It's okay. But he's running on relevant, popular, in some cases, populist issues, or run on, and he promotes, I should say. He's already won his office, and he's
Mm-hmm.
brought all kinds of young people back into the liberal capitalist establishment, right? And then we see, you see, like, for the majority of the Democrats, the majority of this political establishment, that's like, basically cancer to them. They would rather placate Nick Fuentes, Charlie Kirk, and any of these other sort of peripheral Trump figures to try to make themselves seem more amenable. And so, but I also hear a lot about some of these different sort of there's a lot of liberals that love Gavin Newsom, and I think we really have to put that
Mm-hmm.
in context of, again, like a basic class orientation, right? Like he represents like a sanitized corporate respectable image that the Democratic base is just so confident in. They're just so confident in that because they really think that's the way to go, and and that's their strategy, but not recognizing that the majority of this electorate is not interested in another slick corporatist who has
Mm-hmm.
no record of actually fixing the things that he claims he's going to fix. Right? Like if you're like a middle class person with some kind of, or even let's be frank, like if you're an upper middle class person with some interest in tech or real estate, you probably fucking love Gavin Newsom. You probably think Gavin Newsom's like the best fucking thing. But the rest of us, like, we don't trust this guy. Why would we trust this guy?
Yeah.
And so I think it's just important that we see him as a clown. Um, and that until like any of these establishment parties put forward candidates that actually either have a record of addressing their constituents or actually are serious about going against this basic corporatism, they're not going to get young people to vote for them unless they take firm stances against international issues. Like these new young people are not going to vote for them. And so, and then it's going to create this loop where you're going to have more conservatives winning because you have so many of these corporate Dems pissing people off and convincing minorities and young people not to vote. They were going to continue this, and then that's going to be blamed on the masses, sort of like sort of like with Kamala Harris's campaign, or more recently in Texas with Jasmine Crockett's campaign. This idea that like, oh, people don't want black women running for office. Like, no, they don't want corporatists that are pro-Zionist running for office. They don't like that. Like none of these demographics that the Democrats have courted for the last 30, 40, 50 years want any of that bullshit. They are sick of corporatists. They're sick of people that fund foreign wars and fund foreign governments. It doesn't matter if they're the right race. Or the right gender identity. That's not actually going to, these real issues are what's going to convince them. And so, yeah, I don't know. Like, he's an early entry into this race. He hasn't officially entered, but he's probably going to get knocked out, like, closer to the middle, and he might end up getting, like, if there is a Democratic nominee that ultimately wins, he might get a cabinet position or some shit.
Yeah. I can't say this enough. I hate Gavin Newsom. The dude is like literally embodies everything that I don't like about a politician. It doesn't matter that he's done some like progressive things over the years. I think ultimately like his inability to follow through even with the most basic stuff that people have wanted for decades really just underlines like who he really is and who he really represents. I think the one thing I always bring up is the high speed rail, and I think it was like over a decade ago at this point that as a state, California voted to create this high speed rail. And what was the first thing that he did when he came into office? He vetoed it, you know. And now there's like they're doing some construction, and they have this first stage of this rail being done, and that's like I don't know, like 10, 15 years after he initially got into office. And where this rail is supposed to go from? Fucking Merced to Bakersfield. How useless is that? Like, I know things that have to happen in stages, but like, are you fucking kidding me? Like, you got to think about the huge metropolitan areas of Merced and Bakersfield, people. All right. Like, it's just, And I know like this is just like one thing, but it just like really shows just like how incapable someone like him is with doing like really basic shit that could like revolutionize just like one of the largest economies in the world, you know? We could very easily have a high-speed rail from Sacramento all the way to Los Angeles already, and that would change things so drastically for so many people. Um and in addition to that, you know, we just see like all the pandering that he's been doing lately, and just like some of the stuff he's saying, it's like it doesn't make any sense. You know, it's like who is he really speaking to? You know, when he comes out and he's just like, "Oh yeah, like I'm sick of all this like pronoun talk and whatever." It's like, dude, like you sound like MAGA. Like they do sound like one of these people in that. And like yeah, like there are probably a lot of people who voted Republican who you can probably peel off, but they're not a part of the MAGA movement. You know, they might have voted for Donald Trump, but they're not in line with these like hardcore extremists who make up, you know, maybe 10% of the population. You know, there's still 90% of the population that you can still bring in. And a lot of those people are people who don't vote. And a lot of those people are people who are left of, you know, these corporate policies and the status quo of the Democratic Party. And they don't buy into this whole idea that the Democratic Party actually represents any sort of meaningful resistance to Trump, because they don't. You know, they're very much in line with a lot of what he's doing. And they might like, you know, hold up their placards and, you know, cry and yell when he's like making a speech and, you know, like stand in silence, like symbolically, but they don't really do a whole lot else other than that that's meaningful. And they don't actually listen to people on these important issues, you know? And they, you know, they do what Newsom does. They back down when they're actually confronted with the things that they're putting forward. And that's not something that anybody should ever want in a politician, you know? It's like, I think at the end of the day, it's like, if I were to ever support a politician, I'd rather have somebody who was a jerk but got shit done, you know, and actually stayed true to their principles, even if it got them in a lot of trouble, even if they didn't stick around for a long time. I'd rather they stayed true to their principles. But someone like Newsom, you know, it's like he's just a through and through corporate Democrat. Um, you know, he has no principles other than the money that he makes, you know, the status that he holds. Um, you know, it's like this dude grew up in the Marina District. One of his first businesses was opening like a chain of wine stores. Like,
Not
come
even
on.
that long ago.
Yeah, it's like,
Not even that long
come
ago.
on. Like, do you really think this guy is the right fit for most Americans? Do you think most Americans can relate to this guy? Most Americans are going to see this guy and be like, this is exactly who we don't want. We don't want this like slick corporate Democrat coming from California telling us what to think and do. Because that's what a lot of people see in the Democratic Party. That's what a lot of people see in a lot of these other things, whether when they go in other directions, whether they might be misguided or not, you know? And I think ultimately it's a huge mistake that people are making when they think that like, you know, like this is who we got to go with, or this is the best we can do. And ultimately it's not on, you know, progressives to put somebody forth somebody better. It's on the people who actually want to win over a base of support to actually see them for what they really are and do something about it and recognize that like, hey, like if this guy is not somebody that a lot of people want, why are we backing him? Why do we back what he says? Why do we stand for him? You know, because he's not going to be the one that's going to get shit done for people. And yeah, I really hope he just tanks us super fast, because I'm sick of this guy. I don't want to see him ever again. But he's our governor, so
Yeah, you're gonna see him for a while.
yeah.
Watch after he starts. After he becomes a private citizen and just becomes like gets his own tequila brand.
Yeah.
And just goes full hard into being a podcaster, and then he's just in
Yeah.
a third, and then he'll just join the third Trump
Hey,
administration.
at least it'll only be like 25% rum instead of fucking 50% rum like fucking Casamigos.
Yuck. Yuck. All right. So our third segment is we got this lovely interview lined up with a rank and file member of the United Educators of San Francisco. We're going to be talking a little bit about some of their efforts to organize in terms of their union, the recent strike drive, sort of the internal contradictions within the labor union, the struggle to get a contract, the struggle against scabbing. And it's going to be a great conversation. I'm really excited for y'all to tune into it. Good morning. We're
Good morning.
recording this episode on March 14th, 2026,
Mhm.
Saturday morning. It's also Mexican New Year, if anyone's interested. Um, so, we wanted to have this discussion to talk to a member of the rank and file of the United Educators of San Francisco. This has sort of been our sort of update follow up piece about their historic strike they held last month. And sort of just wanted to talk more with the rank and file about how this strike movement developed. What was y'all's relationship like with strike leadership? What was some of the things you experienced during this strike? And how do you think this strike creates the basis for further struggle in the future? Or does it not? What are some of the big issues you see moving forward, as well as some of the positives of this strike movement? Before we get started, it might be useful just, you want to just introduce yourself, Nika, a little bit for the viewers.
Hi, I'm Nika. I'm a special education teacher. I specialize in moderate to severe autism. I work in a Title I inner city middle school.
Thank you so much. We're glad to be having you today.
Yeah, I'm glad to be
Awesome.
here.
Awesome. So, how long have you been a part of United Educators of San Francisco?
I just started teaching in this district in the fall, actually.
Okay, so your first year in the district happened to be
hmm
their first year strike in almost 40 years.
Yeah, though
That's serendipitous.
I personally wouldn't consider that other strike ours. That was when we were kind of a separate union that was just the teachers. Now our union also includes all the substitutes, all the instructional aides, and things like that, which is much better because it's good to have the scabs inside the union. So
Mhm, mhm.
we're a
Right.
continuation, but it's kind of a different organization to me.
So with this strike movement, they've actually expanded the unit to include those people. Those weren't involved in the unit pre last year.
Oh, not last year, but there was a strike in the 70s that they were not included in.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right, just to understand the point. Okay, awesome. So, maybe just take us a little back, further back to maybe the beginning of this fall year, and so maybe just talk a little bit about what was some of the conversation in your union about the ongoing contract and sort of how this negotiation or round of failed negotiations led to a strike. Just walk us
Mhm.
through that a bit.
Yeah, so the messaging we always heard from the union, and honestly, it was pretty well reflected. I like to say I trust my union leadership because the evidence is there. Is the district was completely unwilling to bargain in good faith. They had the rule that any concession they made had to be met with a concession on our end. I don't personally believe this is good negotiating strategy. They also left plenty of non-monetary items on the table even before the strike. They were unwilling to allow us to expand our sanctuary program for students. They were unwilling to allow, we have a program where homeless students and their families can sleep in schools overnight. They were unwilling to discuss that, like even before monetary issues. So that with the I think it was a 0.5% raise that they offered. I believe that they have personally kind of engendered the conditions for the strike themselves, which is not something I think you always see. Um, so yeah, the union itself was just getting more and more militant. You can see that with a lot of our early strike votes were like putting up Saddam numbers, 99%, 97%. So I think there was just a large scale radicalization due to the bosses kind of directly antagonizing us.
Yeah, they have a tendency to do that, right? By being so tight-fisted.
Mhm.
So maybe walk us through a little bit about more so how the mayor's office sort of got involved, because some folks who may have been following from the outside have heard a little bit about Daniel Laurie and his attempts to sort of quell the workers. So maybe can you speak a little more on that?
So this is really interesting to me because very clearly Daniel Lurie has very little political experience and obviously not a lot of experience dealing with unions. He only called our union president 8 days before we were beginning to strike. He's had months to talk about this. We've been very upfront with what our plans are. They've just wasn't on the ball, and his requests are, "Hey, I know you're planning on striking on Monday. Can you just wait 3 days for some more negotiations? Can you just get back to work? I'm offering you nothing. Just do this for me." So I think it was a very politically naive like gesture from him that kind of something I would expect, and it's kind of something I think the district is also kind of familiar with it, that they're just, as unions die off, unfortunately, the political powers that be just don't know how to handle this anymore. This man had no experience, so he just thought he could call us up and say, "Hey, can you just wait?" So beyond that, he did start showing up to negotiations personally. I don't know what he had to say, um, but I don't think it was anything super substantive.
Yeah, I think, it's actually pretty indicative of just how quiet things have been just in general, right? The
Hmm.
fact that they don't even offer a carrot, right, with trying to get people to wait. I think it's because, for the last 40 years, that's all it's really taken, right?
Yeah.
Like leadership has been so able to, or rather, the powers that be, the bosses have been so easy to just, cow the union down
Hmm.
with sort of like these piecemeal negotiations. They actually don't have many other practice tools outside of that. Those tools have always been effective. But as soon as there's a little bit of militancy, you see how people start getting confident, which I think is like the larger point, because we live in a society that doesn't have as nearly as a strong labor movement as say anywhere in Europe or anywhere in any other developing country. But we see how quickly actually folks can gain experience once they start recognizing a little bit of collective power, and how even just sort of the momentum of that is pretty difficult to co-opt or cast aside, at least so openly, right? Because I think was it 5% raises they were agreeing to. That doesn't keep up
Hmm.
with doesn't even keep up with inflation, right?
No.
Essentially asking the workers to agree to a more gradual wage cut, if anything at all, right? So it's
Hmm.
pretty obvious why, like, actually organized militant workers wouldn't accept just waiting 3 more days. 3 more days to do what, right?
Yeah.
So interesting. So yeah, maybe if you could talk a little bit more about how like preparing for that strike went, particularly on your school site, and maybe some other things you heard about others that could also be
Hmm.
helpful. Just how we see how this movement sort of developed from stalling negotiations, attempts to co-opt and totally derail, and then how did this actual strike? How did it take off?
So we had the original strike verification vote, essentially the vote to allow the vote to give the power to the president to call the strike. We have weekly union meetings at my school. I believe a lot of other schools also have them during lunch, so everyone can attend. We have several very, very militant and very, very kind of active strike captains at my site, so that was very helpful. They were going to each and every single person to get us to sign on board. We had a practice picket. I think I think every single school site in the city had a practice picket. I enjoyed it. It was, I think, a lot of it just to like kind of get people used to the concept of marching around. There's a lot of older teachers, they get tired, but kind of just showing, the even kind of, I don't want to say the lumpen, but the people who are super jazzed about it. Hey, we're just going to be walking around outside for 2 hours and then we're going to go to an event. I think there was a lot of good intentionality, especially towards parent groups. The union was very, very aggressive in courting them. And I think it's by the numbers we had turnout for our rallies and our marches, we were able to pretty well engender them to us versus the district. So I think union outreach has been pretty exceptional recently, which I've been quite proud of. I still see posters all over the city for it. So.
Yeah. Could you speak a little more about rallying parents? So I think this is a big piece that folks may not are very curious about.
So obviously, there's a lot of rules about us politically messaging our students. Like we can't tell them how to vote. We can't have a lot of political imagery in the class. Uh, Recently, they have been trying to. A coworker of mine at a different site was asked to remove a shirt that just had the outline of Palestine, things like that. So it was a lot of direct outreach. Like I personally talked to several of my students' parents about it. We were sending flyers home. We had the parent teacher organization was fully on board and actually quite militant themselves. So I think there is just a lot of good communication directly towards the parents that bypassed the district's messaging because they send very formal business emails. I don't assume parents read all the time versus us as a very personal plea. I like to think people thinking about their teacher there's children's teacher quite a lot. We're not quite like your doctor, your dentist, you're someone you have to trust. So I think that does engender kind of when we directly reach out to you about something important, it usually works.
Yeah, I think that personable connection always beats an automatic email blast every single
Yes.
time, right? The ability to actually have a conversation and talk
Mhm.
about the issues in a reasonable way. People are reasonable. If we approach them reasonably, they can
Mhm.
also reach reasonable conclusions that, if the educators aren't treated well, the students can't be treated well, and vice versa.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I know there's some discussion that I heard at least out in the media and whatnot around the issue of scabbing. And
Mhm.
so, with maintaining a proper picket, a proper stoppage, that's also an issue that the workers have to contend with. Is like, how are they going to deal with the bosses potentially bringing in scabs that are going to maintain these school sites operating or whatever sites of production they may be,
Mhm.
and continue on business as usual in a modified capacity. Can you talk a little more about how what scabbing looks like for
Sure.
teachers, and how y'all dealt with the scabs in this phase?
Mhm. So before I get into that, I want to kind of emphasize, even though we're, a public sector union, scabbing is super important to the district because every day they don't provide instruction, the state fines them between $7 to $10 million a day. That is, our demands are only around 100 million, I believe. So after 2 weeks of striking, if they can't get scabs, it's all pointless for them. So scabbing usually takes the place of, substitute teachers and bringing in, outside help. Usually they'll drop the sub-certificate requirements. So they'll bring in kind of really, really shitty people to kind of just keep classrooms going in whatever capacity they can. Now, this was obviously their plan was to bring in these outside scabs, but we stymied it in one pretty simple way. We got the SEIU 1021, I believe. Sorry if I messed that up. Our support workers union. So that's the security guards, cafeteria ladies, janitors. They had a sympathy strike with us, and same with the administrators. So the district is unable to get scabs in that magnitude now that we've removed also all the support staff and all the bosses from the equation. There's simply not enough people for them to fill that gap. Now, their other strategy to keep us off the picket line, which I found I would say distasteful if it wasn't so naive and unthought out, is we all got emails saying instead of we were legally required to report to a staff redeployment zone. So I was assigned to, I believe, Roosevelt. I would have had to go in 2.5 hours earlier than I usually go into work to a school site that is currently being picketed and just sit in a classroom. That's how they wanted to get people off the picket line. Like, you'll get paid if you have to go cross a picket line of strangers several hours earlier and just sit in a dark room. Um, and the emails themselves, while they didn't say it explicitly, they were, I think, sort of worded in the way they were going to try to trick people into thinking that, like, hey, striking's illegal. You got to go here and sit down. It didn't work. Um, uh, we had extra people show up early at those sites to picket and prevent scabbers from going through. I know PSL and DSA also sent out calls for volunteers to come show up. I don't know how that worked, but from a coworker of mine who showed up every day for those anti-scab pickets, it was fairly successful. Very few people went into there. So I think, again, it comes back to the boss's naivety about how they deal with this scene.
Thank you. Dale, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, it's interesting to hear how uh, y'all were dealing with scabs and stuff. I think like another thing that I heard was that they were sending out emails to parents and students basically asking them to take online classes while the strike was happening. Did you hear
Mm,
about this? Like,
yes.
what are your thoughts about this stuff?
So if the students signed up for that and did it on a day-to-day basis, it counted them as in class, meaning the district wasn't fined for that student. Again, we personally reached out to parents. We personally reached out to student organizations, especially in high schools. The students have been very organized for us, so they were able to spread the message of it. Hey, don't fucking do this. If you do this schoolwork, it undercuts your teachers. So again, we did more outreach programs, and I don't believe it really impacted us to a significant degree. Because again, you're asking kids to do homework from home. Why would?
Yeah, kids already don't want to do homework.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
it's like to ask them to be like, hey, do homework and be a scab, then they're probably going to say no.
yeah.
Especially, it's good to hear that most of the students, especially the high schoolers, were aware enough of what was happening that they were like, we're definitely not going to do this. Not only because we wouldn't want to do it in the first place, but because this is just extra gross.
Hmm.
Um, I guess like my other question was like, what kind of like support were like different organizations or like community groups like providing to the teachers and the strikers? Like, how were different people showing up for the strike?
Um, we had a lot of bodies at our marches and rallies. I will say that first and foremost. Just the amount of people we were able to get just to march on City Hall like twice in a row. It's great. Um, there were a lot of food banks. The California Teachers Association, kind of our union federation for the state, is also quite helpful. And a lot of this strike wave recently has been pushed by them. So I'm quite happy with at least their program as a statewide organization. They offered interest-free loans if you needed them. And we had all our support unions also offer a sympathy strike, and they were out with us. So, and I cannot not mention how many restaurants were having like half off for teacher deals. Which I deeply appreciate. But yeah, there was a very strong community showing, including with the LA teachers. They sent their president up. Just a lot of good support from also other unions around the Bay Area. So I didn't really actually feel there was a single kind of sector that didn't support us beyond, the obvious tech right.
Yeah, I think people really like teachers. So it's good that folks were really showing up in different ways to support the teachers and stuff. I'm curious too, like I know like a few years ago, I want to say in like 2019, when the Oakland teacher strike was happening, there was a
Hmm.
lot of different like strike support that was happening to ensure that like, students who would get like their only meal or two at schools would still
Hmm.
be able to get access to that. Were y'all trying to do any of that sort of stuff while the strike was happening? And what was that
Yes.
looking like?
Um, Obviously, I do not have a lot of rich students at my school, so and most of my students do rely on the meals I'm able to give them. So there were several community centers, and obviously the city, I can't say the city didn't help with this. And there were food banks set up, different kitchens, different kind of child care programming set out. And obviously, since this is a good thing, and we don't want to, because while we are a union of workers, I do feel like we do have some sort of responsibility for these children. We've been handing out flyers, instructing the parents about where to get these services. We're fully on board with kind of how the city wanted to distribute the services, especially because, unlike the district, the city themselves weren't going to try to undercut us and count them as like in attendance. So it wasn't rat fucking us in any way.
For sure. That's interesting to hear. Yeah, and I think that also like goes counter to the messaging that like the superintendent was like putting out there. Like
Hmm.
I know most of the people that I know were like just really disgusted at like the crocodile tears that she was showing and being like, just think of the students. And it's like, it's obvious that, like you care and a lot of teachers care and a lot of people in the
Hmm.
community care. And this wasn't like something that was just being thrown to the wayside. Obviously, there was like serious attention to try and still keep these services going, trying to
Hmm.
make sure that students are, having access to the meals that they get every day, while also like maintaining principles and like staying militant and being like, listen, like, like we have to fight for the things that we deserve, that we need. And like, I think also hopefully like to some extent, like exposing the fact that, this sort of lapse can only happen in a world where like, teachers are really and schools are really dependent on all of these things happening and not like
Hmm.
ruffling feathers when in reality it's like that's a huge problem.
I don't get enough food to feed my kids in the first place. Like there's so many burdensome rules. For quite a few days in the last few weeks, I've just been not able to get enough food to have a breakfast for every single one of my students. Like if we're not even feeding them in the first place,
Yeah, very important point. So I want to move the conversation along a little bit to talk about the end of the strike of the tentative agreement and sort of what is the
Hmm.
future for the United Educators of San Francisco with this new contract. Maybe just talk a little bit about how the strike ended and maybe a little bit about this discussion on this tentative agreement. Should folks
Hmm.
accept the tentative agreement? Was there any type of rumblings against ending the strike early? Was there a contingent that was pushing for going further? I just want to talk a little more about that dynamic.
Hmm. So basically, we got them to, the strike was 4 days long. I don't remember the exact timeline, but over the course of Tuesday and Wednesday, we got them to agree to our non-monetary items. That's sanctuary schools and allowing homeless children to sleep in the classroom. All the budgetary items kind of all collapsed on Thursday. On Thursday, like really early in the morning, from what the bargaining told me. Like the district just gave out all at once. So I think there was sort of a incentive to just accept that victory because they had just kind of collapsed in their attempt to provide opposition to our negotiating. There were sectors that didn't think we gone far enough, and I agree. We didn't get the pay rises we wanted, but I think now that our union is kind of very freshly proven that we can win these strikes, extremely militant at this point, I am quite confident in union leadership to win it again for us in the next contract. So we got all the important non-financial stuff. We got the dependents healthcare. We got what's really important for me for a special education teacher, which is reduced workload and overpay if my workload is too much. So I think, yeah, next time I'm pretty confident, and I think the rest of the kind of rank and file is pretty confident in union leadership to pull it off again in the next contract negotiations.
Yeah, and I think that's always the thing to look out for, right? Because
Hmm.
I'm somebody who's in the United Education of SF for the 4 years previously before last year, and I'm not confident in union
Yeah.
leadership to actually fight for its needs. Remember, it's been 40 years since there's been a
Hmm.
strike, right? And in the city, probably one of the most expensive cities in the United States of America, one of the most expensive
Hmm.
cities in the world, the struggle around pay increases is still in doubt, right? Like these are like the basic bread and butter issues that like a Starbucks union is pretty clear on, right?
Hmm.
And so I think there's that interesting question around when to stop fighting. Because again, remember, United Educators of San Francisco is also announcing the round of layoffs, right?
Hmm.
Oakland Unified, another attempt, the school that also was threatening to strike, accepted a tentative agreement beforehand, managed to before striking. Again, the district also announced I think over 400 layoffs, right?
Yeah.
So they give a carrot and they still deliver a stick of
Hmm.
actually uh, uh, cutting teachers, right? Cutting
Yeah.
resources, right? So I think that's like the need for this continued militancy, right? Because I think there's that contradiction. Because I think from the leadership's perspective, they just want to end this unrest as quickly as possible, go back to the status quo, right?
Hmm.
And I think that, and I've talked about this before on the show, that oftentimes these victories are sort of used as evidence that further victories are not possible. Like
Hmm.
I think that goes back to kind of like the economism of the trade union approach. It's like, okay, well, we want a little bit of money here. Do we really have the political will or the good sense to fight budgetary cuts, right? It's like, well, we got
Hmm.
pay raises. Can we really complain if they have to cut the budget, right? Not
Hmm.
understanding that, these people throw away hundreds of millions of dollars just saying no to the teachers, right? The fact that they're fined, what was it, $7 million a day, right?
Hmm.
For when there is a strike, and their reticence to pay $150 million very quickly becomes just chump change, right? Over fines, right? There's
Hmm.
always enough money, right? There's always an ability to actually demand further from the capitalists. And I think
Hmm.
it's that bit of clarity that trade unions, particularly like the more white collar trade unions, need to really understand that rather than kind of identify with the school board. Right. I think that's the deeper issue with a lot of these white collar unions, educator unions, is more often than not, we view ourselves as synonymous with the district, which doesn't make any fucking sense because these people used to back slavery and segregation. Like, why do we identify
Hmm.
with these people?
Yeah.
right? I mean, it's interesting. I think how many, remember the United Educators in San Francisco, rather the San Francisco Unified School District, used to have and I think still does, has the highest disparity between administration and educators. I think it wasn't until long ago that the San Francisco United School District, had more administrators than LA Unified. To give you some comparison, San Francisco Unified has, I think, at that time, was about 50,000 students, most likely
Mhm.
less. LA Unified had 2 million students, but they have the same number of administrators, right? Meaning these people are just hoarding money. They're hoarding money, and the people who get cut first are the communities that are supposed to be served, and not these administrative leadership parasites. Yeah, and so I think it's hopeful that this militancy, it's the first militancy in almost 40 years that the
Mhm.
United Educators in San Francisco has shown. The hope I really hope is that unions like this and unions around the country and unions that have not even been formed yet can actually look to this current period of labor organizing and actually take it forward to the next step. Hopefully, continue these struggles for economic gains, as well as maybe even put forward some political demands, which of course is explicitly illegal in the United
Mhm.
States of America, but that's another issue. Like I know we're kind of winding down to the end of this discussion, so I'm curious if you had
Mhm.
any other closing thoughts. Dale, do you have any other closing thoughts before we wrap up this discussion?
It's interesting. I think you mentioned it's like the first militancy we've shown in 40 years, which is correct. But I think it's important to mention that we recently had a pretty big leadership change. PSL kind of took over the union. I don't believe the president is currently PSL, but the vice president and a lot of other major officers are. They ousted a very kind of moderate Lowell High School controlled union leadership. They actually cut union officer pay. They moved more of the budget towards member services, especially away from the chicken dinner circuit. Essentially, there's all these conventions, and they were sending teachers there for free vacations on just on our dime, and they've cut that down to only the minimum two, which I appreciate. So in the last few years, there has been a definite kind of left-wing takeover of the union. And from talking to members of leadership, there is simply no oppositional bloc. There's a few scattered Zionists, but they all have such divergent political opinions otherwise, they can't really offer any kind of opposition. So I think solid left wing, I don't even want to call it entryism because they were kind of just status quo liberals who really didn't even bother, uh, seemingly can be effective, even if it is unfortunately PSL.
Yeah, I think that's an important point you're bringing up. It's like, even though these unions haven't really played the role that they need to, they still can be working class organizations, working class institutions that can actually serve working class interests. And yeah, I think like pushing out, like you're saying, like pushing out this like kind of Lowell High School contingency, that's actually a really good thing because we've seen, what Lowell High School represents or
Mm-hmm.
has represented historically, which is just segregation and elitism and classism and a lot of really not great stuff. That's definitely a step in the right direction. And I think like yeah, like I think we're seeing in a lot of places in California, teachers either gearing up to strike or striking. It's like it happened here in San Francisco. There were talks in Oakland. They were striking in LA not too long ago. I'm pretty sure they're striking in Sacramento right now, you
Mm-hmm.
know? And I think it's important that, people see this for what it is and really go out there and support it. And for all these different teachers unions in the state and the nation to really like try to come together around this stuff because it's just like isolated pockets here and there. It's like
Mm-hmm.
yes, San Francisco is one of the most expensive cities, not just in the United States but maybe even in the world. California is a huge economy. The United States is a huge economy. We have enough money to pay teachers, to actually take care of teachers, take care of the people, the students that they're serving, the communities that they're serving. And it's going to take teachers and lots of other people coming together to really like push for that in a militant and principled way. So yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, Nika, for your time. It
Of
was great
course.
talking to you about the work that you and your comrades, the union, have been doing. Um, Is there anywhere that folks can? I don't know. We're not gonna do the reach out part since you're kind of doing it honestly of your school site. You normally like
Mhm.
kind of plug.
Yeah, please don't come to my workplace.
Yeah, we were not going to do any of that. Don't worry about it. So yeah, again, just thank you so much for your time talking with us today. It's been an amazing discussion.
All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me.
All right, everybody. That's been our episode.
Yeah. That's it for this episode. Episode 7 in the books. Yeah. Feel pretty good about it.
Yeah. Sick, y'all. Remember, give us a like, follow the page, subscribe to us. If you have any questions, comments, criticisms, all those stuff can be directed toward us on any of our pages. And if something you want us to cover, please let us know.
Yeah, definitely. Please give us any feedback that you have. We really appreciate your support. We're doing all this organically, one follower at a time. We're not making any money doing this. We're doing this just because we feel it's really important. And so we really appreciate every time you like our posts, anytime you share stuff, any feedback you give us. It really means a lot to us as we're, building up this podcast. So thank you so much.
All right. Y'all have a good rest of your day. Y'all stay safe out there.
See ya.